You could sense that something inside Scrappy had broken by the time the cameras began to roll, because the air in Atlanta has been thick for months. This was not the same man who had been seen joking to lighten the situation, smiling through stress, or stepping in as an intermediary when the Harrises and Frosts were adamant about maintaining their pride. His vibe was very different tonight. It was evident in the weight of his voice from the first frame. What he said wasn't need to be noisy. There was no need for theatricality in his body language. Only the he signaled to the room that he was finished by leaning back in his chair, his shoulders stiff, his gaze set. He wasn't no longer harboring resentment against others. He wasn't settling family disputes that weren't his. The line had been crossed, and Scrappy was prepared to make a scarring, deep pull. The VH1 producers had been consuming like wolves around raw meat this quarrel. Every group meal, vacation special, and reunion show had become a battleground as soon as Kirk, Frost, and Harris from Mendesk entered the same area, and Scrappy was constantly at the middle of the chaos, pulled in whether that was something he desired. While everyone else hurled dirt, he was forced to balance friendships, loyalty, and his own sanity. Once he attempted to play peacemaker. He pleaded with them to move and put an end to the conflict, moving ahead to keep in mind that Atlanta was large enough for everyone to breathe without running into each other. Peace, however, doesn't compensate. It is chaos. Each conflict became more messy as a result. Scrappy was drowning in baggage that had never been his in the first place, and each insult made things worse. The camera saw him looking around the room as if he had now understood that he had been yelling into space. No one was listening. He was exhausted, but no one seemed to care. All they were concerned about was who could outscream the other, who could deliver the most vicious punch, and who could prolong the conflict for another episode. The stillness was finally broken by Scrappy. His tone was harsh but low. I never want any of you to think that I'm taking sides. All I want is for them to be in a positive environment. However, it seems that every time we organize an event, we must question, should we invite? Do we invite the Harrises or the Frosts? That statement weighed heavily. It was more than a bad dinner party or a vacation to Puerto Rico. It was about mature adults using every get-together as a battlefield and making everyone else pay the price. Harris of Mendesk attempted to defend himself, but his remarks were more akin to dousing a fire with gasoline. Frustrated, he broke his voice as he warned them that the whole room piled on top of him as he slid. However, Jan Dandy Smith suffered a slip-up. She was protected by a wall of women who were willing to pardon, defend, and shelter her. His voice was unvarnished, urgent, and real. We are unable to prevail. He was talking about more than his marriage. He was pointing out their world's complete imbalance, the disparities in treatment, the burden that males like him had to bear, but women were able to trip and yet get up. Regardless of the room's opinion, he was clearly exhausted. Then there was Kirk Frost, displaying the haughtiness of someone who somehow feels unaffected by the past. Kirk wouldn't lose if hypocrisy were a sport. Rashida was humiliated by this man on national, dragging her through controversy after scandal on television. Jasmine Washington's side kid, the infidelity, the years ago, everything should have been over because of innumerable betrayals. However, he was now accusing Meneses of giving a loyalty lecture to another man, as though his own marriage wasn't suffering from the identical problems he caused. It was almost comical, and Scrappy's expression indicated that he agreed. However, Rashida's craziest aspect was she was still there, rock solid by her husband's side. Devoted, unflinching, and reluctant to acknowledge that the foundation of the guy she protected was inconsistency. Although her commitment was strong, it gave the impression that she was blind and maybe even involved in the hypocrisy that permeated everything Kirk said. Young Jack played his typical part in the midst of everything, the unintentional agitator. His lighthearted comments, his quips, and the way he carried murmurs from one side of the room to they always caused mayhem, even if the other wasn't intended to do so. He was unaware that each time he was stoking a fire that was already out of control by repeating a remark or telling a joke that was tinged with reality. And each time the flames increased in intensity, the person caught in the crossfire was Scrappy. Jock dismissed it with a laugh. Tenacious suffered as a result. And for that reason, tonight was unique. Scrappy reclined, he shook his head and spoke steadily, but with a weariness that no man could pretend to have. Man, I'm exhausted. I've had enough of this. You guys keep making this seem like it will never end. We moan. Take care of your issues without involving me. The quiet was captured on camera. That came next. And for once, turmoil was overshadowed by stillness. Nobody anticipated that's how he checked Kirk Frost. Not when the cameras are rolling. Not with Rashida Dagger staring across the table. Scrappy, however, did not blink. He wasn't present to no longer play it safe. What everyone else had been too scared to speak out, he stated. This quarrel was stale, poisonous, and useless. The serenity in his voice added to its impact. He wasn't shouting. He posed no threat. He wasn't leaving like a man having an outburst. His silence was more terrifying than a cry, due to the fact that when you can tell it's true when a man like Scrappy, who has endured betrayals, divorces, court fights, and public humiliation, declares he's done. He wasn't weak by being silent. The room sensed that it was finality. However, rather of accepting that reality and embracing it, the same cycle resumed. Kirk sidestepped, shifting the burden to like a magician. Mendez tries to divert attention from his own shortcomings. Rashida gazed silently, refused to acknowledge that her spouse was at fault. Mendez became agitated, defensive, and prepared to retaliate at anybody who questioned him. Yandandi waited for the next hit while holding on to her dignity like a shield. And in order to avoid being choked by the discomfort, Jock made another joke. Everybody was so preoccupied with their own defenses that they failed to see what had just transpired. Scrappy had turned into a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw reflected back. It was all captured on camera. The raw moment when a guy who had been the glue for years suddenly acknowledged he was cracking. The sighs, the steps, and the awkward quiet. This wasn't about who skipped someone's party, who lied or who cheated for once. This concerned a man who would not stop being the idiot. Like smoke from a fire, his last words lingered in the atmosphere. This meat is worn out. Take care of yourself before you attack others. Whether anyone in that room actually heard him is now the question. Was that his own skeleton that Kirk Frost processed? Yell more loudly than his classes? Was Mendez Harris aware that his conflict with Yandi had turned into a circus act that the public was watching? Pulled the others into the ring? Did Rashida and Yandi realize that although their devotion is commendable, it might be the exact thing that's causing the upheaval, rather than bringing it to a halt? Or are they also dependent on attention, so engrossed in the narratives that Scrappy's breaking point will only be used as a headline, a meme, or another footage for VH1's profit? Because this is the reality. Scrappy wasn't playing a bluff. The expression in his eyes described a tale that words couldn't. He was prepared to leave it all behind. From the if it meant rescuing himself, he would risk the mess, the drama, the cameras, and even the friendships. And in the event that Scrappy really leaves this battlefield, then between the Frosts and the Harrises, who is left to carry the dirty laundry? When the intermediary becomes the messenger, destroys the bridge? The quiet that ensued after Scrappy's remarks didn't simply stop that evening. It persisted. You could feel the aftershocks reverberating across the room by the time the group reassembled. Despite Atlanta's size, news spreads more quickly in our group than any headline. And everyone has heard it previously. About Kirk Frost being examined by Scrappy in front of cameras. They entered anticipating a storm. Rashida arrived first, looking as dapper as ever and supporting her husband as if nothing could sway her. Presuming he hadn't been shamed on camera, Kirk followed her with his chin up and his pride intact. Kirk's hallmark move is that, pretend the blow never came. Even when his expression conveys a different message, act as though he is still in charge. When Harris, Yandandi Smith, and when Mendez Harris walked in, the atmosphere changed once more. Yandandi maintained her customary composure while looking over every corner as if she was aware that everyone was watching her. Mendez moved heavy and rigid, a guy who had been boiling for years. Of judgment. They didn't have to speak. As they moved, so did the tension. Then, with a sharper but quieter presence than before, Scrappy arrived. He wasn't explosive right now. He was not obliged to be. His piece had already been said, and his everyone else's talk was drowned out by quiet. The room froze when Scrappy and Kirk met eyes. There was only a dense air that could be cut with a knife. There were no phony grins or handshakes. In an attempt to fit in, young Jock cracked a joke about how the tension was so thick that it could be spread on toast. There were a few tense giggles, but nobody calmed down. Scrappy didn't give him a look. His attention was on Kirk, who grinned like a man who would not give up. Kirk grinned as if a man who would not give up. Light struck up a discussion. Music, relatives, informal updates, but the true fissures quickly became apparent. Kirk shrewdly said regarding loyalty and recognizing who is truly reliable when the cameras are not in use. Everyone understood who he was referring to, even if it wasn't loud or blatant. Leaning forward, Scrappy spoke in a calm yet sharp voice. If you aren't loyal to yourself initially, loyalty doesn't mean anything. Don't discuss loyalty with me if you haven't dealt with it at home. The room was filled with the words, similar to a hammer. Rashida's face tensed, as though she was pleading with Scrappy to stop before he could do any more damage. Yandi's lips was covered as if she were suppressing a gasp, and her eyes grew wide. Jock Mendez slumped back in his chair, partly grinning, almost relieved, and mumbled, "Here we go again." That he wasn't the one who got hit for once. Kirk's pride prevented him from being silent. He retorted with his typical haughtiness. "Don't misunderstand. I don't respond to you. Mine was constructed by me. I don't need someone to tell me that I kept my... How do I manage my home?" However, his voice broke just enough to show the bruising that Scrappy had caused. Scrappy remained unblinking. He had no concern pressing on the weak place, and he knew precisely where it was. Although it didn't have to, back and forth didn't degenerate into a yelling war. More fire was carried by the weight of what was being uttered than by higher voices. Never would. Scrappy was speaking to more than just Kirk. He was shouting out to the whole structure, the years of support, and the manner in which this group tolerated duplicity in order to maintain appearances. He had grown weary of serving as a circle that flourished on disorder. And he made it plain tonight. By the time nothing had been resolved by the end of the night. First to depart was the ice, and Kirk muttered angrily to Rashida as she maintained her expression icy. Mendez and Yandundi trailed behind, their nerves jangling but their pride intact. Jock remained behind and made jokes that were not very funny. Additionally, Scrappy, he sat quietly, unconcerned. A man who had at last escaped the role of messenger to everyone. It was no longer in his possession, but the equilibrium was lost as Scrappy retreated. Without an intermediary to deflect the punches, the Frosts and the Harrises would now have to confront one another head-on. Additionally, there was the type of risk that might cause a dispute to blow out. Weeks passed before the fallout became apparent. It happened right away. The fissures became too large to overlook the instant Scrappy withdrew himself from the center. The Frost and the Harrises lacked a barrier, a filter, and a cushion to lessen the impact of his strikes in his absence. The following. The gathering didn't have the vibe of a reunion. It seemed to be a stalemate. Each chair, each look, each moment of the weight of unresolved business hung over the talk. Kirk Frost entered first, his chest swollen as if he thought nothing could give him a shake. He was too proud to display the bruises that Scrappy had left behind. He straightened his jacket, smiled for the cameras, and pretended that he still had control of the entire globe. Rashida following, inscrutable, her face as polished as before. Her quiet was a disguised act of loyalty. It was the same mask she had worn for years of humiliation, betrayal, and hushed suspicions. It seemed naturally to her to stand behind Kirk. Mendeezes Harris came in close, even if her commitment meant sacrificing her own tranquility. Like a man harboring resentments too strong to carry inside for very long. His body language was rigid, his jaw was set, and his eyes were focused on Kirk. He walked with the burden of someone who had been villainized too often. Someone who had observed other evade responsibility as his errors were brought to light. Yandundi Smith entered next to him, her chin resting on her shoulder. High, dominating the room with her presence. She was not going to be shook. Her purpose in being here was to remind everyone that she did not bend, despite how chaotic the storm became. Then came Scrappy, who was steady, silent, and menacing. There was no need for him to lift his speak or make a joke. He might have said nothing, but the stillness surrounding him said louder. This man had determined he was no longer going to be anyone's pawn and had burnt the job of intermediary. The shift came immediately after he sat down. It was felt by all. He wasn't here to keep anyone's face intact, wasn't here to transport rumors from one person to another. His silence was the caution. Don't include him in your games, though. It was programmed in for the first several minutes. Uncomfortable banter. All of it, music, business, and family, was a flimsy attempt to cover up the strain that was underneath the surface. It was short-lived. Kirk couldn't sit because of his pride. Silently. When the cameras stopped rolling, he slipped in a nice statement about loyalty and recognizing who your true friends are. It wasn't noisy. The implication was obvious even if it wasn't straightforward. What he said aiming for Scrappy. Leaning forward, Scrappy spoke in a cool tone that sliced through the atmosphere like a scalpel. If you aren't loyal to yourself initially, loyalty doesn't mean anything. Don't discuss with me when you haven't even managed your own at home. The room froze at the words. Rashidita instantly tensed up. Her lips were squeezed close as if she wanted to halt the moment before it got out of control, and her eyes narrowed. Yandandi provided coverage, her mouth suppressing a gulp. Man, here we go again, Jock murmured to himself. I'm trying but failing to chuckle. And Mendez sat back, almost grinning, glad that he wasn't the target of the shot for once. Kirk's pride wouldn't let him back down, so he fought to maintain his position. He responded sharply and defensively. Don't misunderstand. You are not my boss. Mine was constructed by me. I don't need anyone telling me how to manage my home, therefore I kept my... Although he spoke firmly, there was a tiny fracture and he was deceived by his tone. Scrappy remained unblinking. He shook his head as he leaned back. Y'all going to learn? That one sentence struck a deeper chord than any argument. A guy with nothing left to lose was warning him. Young Jock attempted to lighten the atmosphere once more. However, his quips fell flat this time. His apprehensive expression was captured on video, disappearing as Scrappy's gaze pierced the table. Jock instantly recognized this. Wasn't the Scrappy who had previously allowed things go downhill. The intermediary had vanished. By the end of the evening, nothing was resolved. Kirk the Frost departed first, fiercely speaking to Rashida as she kept her face icy. Her devotion remains anchored despite the strain that was burning through her quiet. The Harrises came next, their dignity intact, although it's obvious their footsteps were heavy and trembling as they left. Jock hovered, offering side remarks. Remarks that no one found funny, knowing full well, the upcoming episode would force him to appear foolish. Scrappy remained seated. Instead of pursuing anyone, he didn't attempt to put together his explanation, bringing together what was already damaged. He sat, cool, collected, and nearly impervious, for he wasn't for the first time in years, bearing the burdens of others. He wasn't the glue or the message, wasn't the broker of peace. He was finished, and everyone was most frightened by that. Since Scrappy isn't in the center, the Harrises and Frosts would have to confront one another directly. No filter, no intermediary, nobody to tidy up after the explosion. Additionally, when pride, devotion, and years of animosity clash with nobody in the center to take the hit, the A-bomb is unavoidable. The cameras pan out as the credits began to roll. However, the tension didn't stop there. It trailed them away. The door, their vehicles, and the rumors about nightlife in Atlanta, and on the waiting times for fans to select sides. The bomb had been dropped by Scrappy. Presently, the one question remains unanswered. Was easy.